Okay, I want to talk to you today for about an hour on themes from the first chapter of a book that I'm writing with Lee Rainey. Lee's the director of the Media Lab, of the Pew Internet and American Life Study in Washington, D.C. And we keep changing the title of the book, so I put all three of them up there. As of today, according to our publisher, it's going to be called The Networked Individual. They think that's the title that will sell, and it's going to be out June 2010. Sometimes we call it Connected Lives, and today I'm going to emphasize the triple revolution, the coming together of the internet, especially in its personal mode, of mobile connectivity, access to data and to people, and how this is affecting social transformations, especially towards a more networked society. Be very little technology in this lecture, more on what's the meaning of it all for how we're transforming ourselves. And I've been working on this for a long time. This cartoon, I didn't change the name. It was in there as Barry, and I've never met Mr. Seapress, the New Yorker cartoonist. I've been online since 1976, well before the internet existed, on some precursors. And it's not true that I check my email 200 or 300 times a day. It possibly is more because it's on continuously. I've bitten the bullet, and I now have two big screens in my office. And one of them just has my email address. And that's actually interesting because in the old days, we used to ask questions. The old days was 5 years ago, of course, is how much time do you spend on the internet? And I don't know what to say except from morning to night, every single day is on. Whether I'm there or having dinner or talking with my wife or going shopping, it's still there. And of course, the same thing is now true for mobile phones. And the very first thing that people do, actually, when they finish a lecture in my shop, is they get up and they check their phones. And I started asking them how many of them don't have cell phones, don't have landlines, old-fashioned wired phones. How many people here don't have a landline phone? Wow, that's a pretty high number for an audience that's somewhat mature than the undergrads I spoke with at Fayetteville yesterday. In general American stat is 15%, and I think we're about there now. How many people sleep with their cell phones under the pillow or next to them? I hope you turn the vibrating function off when you do that. You can get easily confused. But we're into a new phase of life. And of course, whereas the old household phone used to be shared among everybody, or sometimes if you were stuck, you gave your teens their own phone, now we each have our own cell phone. I mean, it would be pretty obscene if I asked to borrow someone's cell phone. You know, you'd have to wipe it clean afterwards. It's a personal item. It's really part of your body. So I want to talk about some of the implications on this and about a controversy that's been brewing, well, ever since 1887 when Friedrich Tönnies came out with a distinction between city life, which he despised and said nobody talked to each other, and country life. Wait, who's running the audio? Because I think there's a little bit of echo in here. And Bob Putnam came out with Bowling Alone, just about a decade ago. The book was written in 1998, 99, and published in 2000, claiming that there's been a breakdown in American community. Bob talked about declining enrollments in churches, in school organizations, in social clubs, such as Rotary, PTA meetings, stuff like that, and really started people worrying about the end of community. And then in 2006, Miller McPherson, Lynn Smith-Lavin, and Matt Brashears came out with an article that used that the number of people that Americans can discuss important matters with has declined from 2.9 in 1984 to 2.1 20 years later. So a pretty huge decline of the amount of people you can discuss important matters with. Now, that you may think in discussing important matters as things like war and peace or the depression that both our countries are undergoing right now. But in fact, when we went out and asked people what the important matters were, a lot of that stuff had to do with where can you get a good hairdresser, and stuff that was personally important to people but may not have been a significant situation. What we're finding, and I'll go into this later, is if you expand the criterion of people you're socializing with, we find that community, number of friends, and the quality relationships probably are expanding rather than not. I want to tell you a little story about Peter and Trudy Johnson-Lenz, a nice, good friends of mine. Trudy, lady in the left, fell in her garden and cracked her skull on a rock. It was a very similar injury to Natasha Richardson's that you may have read about a few weeks ago, except Trudy was smarter than Natasha. Trudy, they got her right to a hospital, and they took 1/3 of her skull off. Now, these self-employed people in a country that doesn't have universal health care and they had no real benefits needed a lot of help. But they invented group social networking in the late 1970s, and they organized their friends, once Trudy was better, to move, and Peter certainly did, to supply money. They went on Google Calendar, and they organized caregiving networks. They put out on blogs. They didn't use Twitter, it wasn't really big then, email lists, and they set up pay sites for people to contribute money. So they used many of the tools we're talking about, and now Trudy's doing quite well, and that really came to her mobilization. So what we're really at is the intersection in the theme of today's letter. One is the proliferation and differentiation of the internet. We all think we know what it is. But I want to emphasize the personal side. Unlike television, it's a one-on-one experience, you and your computer, especially with laptops where you sit even closer. Whereas television, people used to sit further back and take it all in. Second is that you have mobile access, and you all have turned off your phones and put them on silent mode. I hope, unlike Rudolph Giuliani, where did that weird incident happen where his wife called him in the middle? But this is very personal, and it's always with you, and it links to a turn that actually started happening before, that is from bounded groups to loosely knit social networks. And I'll go into these things in a little bit more depth in a second, but my talk is grouped around these connections. And it's going to accumulate in this book that we're just starting to write. It'll come out in 2010. That links my research in Toronto and north of Toronto with the Pew Internet Surveys research, which is American National Survey stuff, and some things from the World Internet Project. Now, I live in Toronto, and we're just over the US border over there, just north, a little bit north of Buffalo. We always send them foreign aid and snow clearing equipment. And this actually was when the North American Free Trade Agreement was set up, and where we thought manufacturing would move into Mexico, and actually it hasn't, but not, well, it's moved also offshore. And retail, of course, used to be an American pastime until about Christmas this year. And within, how many people have been to Toronto? Oh, amazing. I bet you haven't been there in January. I know you, I know. I haven't been there in January. Anybody been there in the winter? Did you like to shovel snow? You can come anytime to my house. But, oh gosh, we study East York, which is a residential area, working class, middle class one, and it's about a half hour by public transit or car from the central business district. Most people would go there by public transit because it's a lot easier to get there. And we did a lot of surveying, we did a lot of interviewing, and I'm not going to spend much time on that now. So let's talk about the three revolutions. One is you have instant access to diverse, copious information, as Sarah was pointing out. I used to be a TV quiz kid. Anybody remember a show called College Bowl? It used to be on. Well, that was me. We beat Berkeley. And boy, were they surprised. And I used to think I'd be out of business when Google came along, but it turns out you have to know how to talk to Google. You have to know how to ask questions and what to look for, and sometimes it isn't that easy. I'm going to really, things I'm saying are obvious, but I think they add up to some non-obvious differences. Time isn't a constraint. If your husband is working a night shift and you're working a day shift, sometimes all you can do is email him, and hopefully he'll get it at some point. Distance is and is not a constraint. It is a constraint because, as I keep lecturing computer scientists, we have bodies. Gates doesn't quite realize that, certainly not Ballmer. And that means that most of the communication we do by any electronic means is linked to our physicality. Let's meet for lunch later, let's stay in touch, and so proximity is really important. At the same time, when we just look at email by itself, in the Toronto study we did, it's as people email as frequently 3,000 miles away as they do I'm sorry, I wrote this in kilometers, but it would work in miles as they do in 3 kilometers. So the internet has very much actually helped people to talk to each other, if by talking you include texting, voicemail, mobile phones, Twittering, etc. And certainly the velocity is very important, and sometimes for bad or good. My cousin died yesterday at 4 in the afternoon. I got the call at 5:45, and I was scheduled to speak at Fayetteville at 6, and the show went on. I would have much rather I wasn't findable at that moment, because there's not very much I can do except feel miserable. And we studied people in their own homes. Any computer scientists here? Yeah. Well, as you know, computer scientists don't look at ordinary people. Some do. Intel Corporation's actually paying for my research now, and they've been totally benign. They don't tell me what to do. But so we went out and interviewed ordinary people in an ordinary part of Toronto, and these are their beautiful homes. You can see it's a little bit old. It's 2004, 2005. They don't have flat screens. And as one of my students said to me when I showed this in class, "Oh my God, they still have tapes." And of course, the world's changing. Hired a young sophomore this year to work for me, and one of the things that came up, she's a Janis Joplin fan. And I said, "Great, would you bring in some CDs?" She looked at me. "CDs? Do you still use those?" So, you know, she's an MP3 person. So a lot of things are going on. One, the increasing bandwidth of the internet. You probably are getting 1 million megabytes, 1 megabyte a second or more, means you can download a lot of pictures, you can get a lot of fancy graphics on the web, stuff that 10 years ago you wouldn't even think about doing. Secondly, it's available anywhere, anytime. I almost didn't make the plane down here today because I got an exciting email about 5 minutes before takeoff time. And so it's following you, or you're getting connected with it. But it turns out that the 2 most obvious places people use the internet are, 1, their office, and 2, their house. 3 is convergence happening at a great rate. Those of you who are iPhone mavens sure know that, is that we're seeing a switch that any device will be able to access many means of communications with smartphones and with netbooks. And fourth, I'll go into the portability thing a bit later, but obviously you can take it with you. We were reminiscing before that when laptops were 30 pounds, the original Osbornes or the compacts that some of you recognize. Now it's pretty easy, if you want to pay for it, to get a 2.5 pound machine or even smaller netbook. And you can go around the world. I just did a collaboration with India, and that was great because I would ship them the stuff at midnight just about the time they were waking up, and then they would work on it and ship me back. So I would have it the next day while I was sleeping. And then it's personalized in many ways. Sarah here has her own way of getting the news. I use my Yahoo. There are a number of different ways you can make it more or less work for you, and that's going to get better. Second revolution is the mobile access one, the stuff in your pocket or handbag. And you just can get to things really, really easy. But the important thing, as I said before, and I guess I'll repeat for I hope the last time, this is a very intimate device. I mean, the only person that gets this close to me is my wife. And I wish that were a bit more frequently than I use the phone. Sorry, honey. And so it's something tailored to you, and that's a big difference than the old days when the phone rang in the living room and 3 people ran to answer it and everybody heard the call. And you can connect in many, many places. These are just slides I pulled down in about 5 minutes. From modern life. Ooh, what happened? So, I lost a few slides there. And then the third is the social network revolution, which I think is a new way of expanding behavior. Most people think in terms of groups. The village, you know, Mrs. Clinton wrote a book called It Takes a Village, and I think she got it partially right. I'm sorry, only partially, because I think it takes a network. And what's the difference? A village is a single bounded unit in which a lot of people are doing a lot of different things with each other. Networks tend to be you're switching among multiple groups in multiple different relationships, and the ties tend to be pretty specialized. So one of the keys to life is maneuvering among these fragmented, sparsely knit networks where most people don't know each other, and that are somewhat permeable and accessible. And that means that you got to have individual agency. You can't sit back and let your older sister or your mother arrange family dinners, because each one of you has to be making the connections that are going on. I think a key part of that came with President Obama's insistence that he must have his BlackBerry at all times. He's used to connecting by himself and moving between a number of worlds. However, I understand, and I could be corrected here by people who know more, that the amount of maneuverability he has is much, much less because of security reasons. Communications maneuverability. So takeaway number 1 is the ties and events are organized around the individual rather than a unit such as the family, neighborhood, or organization. And we're very, but this is these 2 days, and the only times I've given this talk in the South, and I'm very interested in cultural variation. I would love to hear at the question and answer period at the end, if what I'm saying actually doesn't fit your lived experience. So we're heavily involved with person-to-person contact, and this is a caricature, of course, but in the old days, has never been pinned down, people lived in villages, and it took a village to raise a child, that it worked in single groups. Now what we call globalization is certainly taking place, where people still live and work in units, but they get on the freeway and they drive here, and they don't know anything that's happening along the way. Or you get on the telephone, those use landlines in family homes, and the call's going out somewhere, but you don't know where. My grandmother used to shout on the telephone because she was sure that was the only way the noise would get from Brooklyn to the Bronx. But the units still exist, and to some extent this is true. All of these are still somewhat true. But what I'm arguing is we're moving towards the individual as the organizing unit, not the family or the work group. And with that is a great deal, it's a double, I can't phrase it any better, a great deal of non-awareness of context. You'll email somebody, you don't know where they are. And you don't know who else is with them looking over at your screen. I remember when George I ran the first Iraqi war, they were afraid to use video conferencing. I was involved in video conferencing a lot in those days, because they were afraid of who was lurking off camera. So each side, the commanders and the president's office, had some diffidence about using it. But a very common thing is as soon as you talk to somebody on the phone, the very first question is, where are you and who's with you? Because you want to reestablish that imagery of context, which isn't the same as calling into the living room was in the old days. Now, this is not a heavy public transit state, but Ontario, Canada, where I live, is, and Toronto, the city especially. And so I'm riding the buses and the subways and streetcars. We still have streetcars all the time. And up until about 2 years ago, people would be on there, and I would very much participate in their romantic life. Hi, I really, really love you. I can't wait to come home and be in an arm. Sometimes I would chime in and say, oh, that's so nice. And then they would look at me. Because, as I say here, private concerns have replaced public civility in a lot of that. People in Toronto have learned how to murmur in their phone. And even more so, they've caught up to the rest of the world, is they're texting rather than using a voice chat. There's been a major shift towards that. But the big thing, and the thing that the media often gets wrong, is online interactions are very, very rarely isolated. When people are talking to others on a cell phone or Twittering or emailing or blogging or Skyping or what have you, they're often going to see that person face to face often. Hi, I really love you, I can't wait to be in your arms, is a pointer ahead to impending physical contact. And so the media often gets it wrong. They often think there's a second life that's separate from the first life. Second point I want to argue is that families are changing. By families, I mean household families, into more as networks than as group. We know, and Bob Putnam got this right in Bowling Alone, they're spending less face time together, or flesh time, or whatever word you want to use, than they were in the 1970s and 1980s. The amount of family meals has gone from 6 to 3 per week in that period. And same thing's true up in Toronto, which in many ways tracks the US in interpersonal relations, although politically we're just a lot, no, I shouldn't insult my audience. Okay, a lot more relaxed. So, but one of the things we find is people are in frequent contact. One of my undergraduate assistants texts her husband on cell phones 50 times a day. Anybody doing 50 a day here to one person? Nobody's fessing up. One guy. You're a lucky guy, or she's a lucky, or he or she is a lucky girl. We have gay marriage in Canada, so I just don't assume anything anymore. And I want to thank you Americans for gay marriage, because we're getting some really interesting people immigrating to our country. And at the same time, knowing what family members are doing all the time fosters surveillance, which may or may not be obtrusive. Average kid's getting a cell phone in North America somewhere between 8 and 11, and the kids are clamoring for it, but what they don't realize is they're now on somewhat of a leash with their parents. I mean, they can fake where they are to some extent, but you know, if the parents are smart, they'd say, why don't you point the camera around and show me what's around you? And then if you get Google Latitudes installed on the iPhones, Latitudes will show you physically where they are at any time. It's an interesting surveillance device, for better or worse. I'm certainly resisting getting it in our household. But FEMA, for example, is using it to find out where their second responders are at all times in an emergency situation, using that in Twitter. Who doesn't know what Twitter is, by the way? Okay, just a couple of people. Twitter's it's like sending text messages by the computer. So anyway, things have changed. Remember those? How many people remember Ozzie and Harriet? Wow, surprise. I'm trying to find a modern equivalent. Any modern equivalents of family togetherness? There's a show called, Homer? No, I don't want dysfunctional. There's a show called something Son or something that some of my students mentioned. I forget the name. And I grew up reading Fun with Dick and Jane as my primer, as many of you may have, and a very traditional role model. Oh, Father, will you please do something? Help me, help me. Father, mother, formal role structures. By the way, not that I'm encouraging you to go there, but there's a pornographic version of Fun with Dick and Jane available on the net. And now we get this kind of thing, little girls with their new, child-friendly cell phone, mother relating more to her cell phone than the kid who's going to be dropped any second. And I just pulled these down for 5 minutes on the web. And just these are quotes from some of the interviews we've done for those who like qualitative analysis. Tracy Kennedy and I did, this comes from our paper called The Networked Household. Pew Internet people did a statistical heavy paper called Networked Families, and they're all showing the same thing. A lot of communication by many means, and the internet is actually fostering that communication. One of the things that's true for those of us who push symbols around, what's sometimes called knowledge workers, is people are doing it all day from work if they can get away with it. I'm trying to get some information for folks on assembly lines, those that still exist, and seeing if that's happening there or in shops. But certainly white-collar folks, as I assume the great majority of this audience is doing a lot of connectivity between home and work. Many times it's illegal, and sometimes corporations enforce restrictions on what you can do. Anybody work in an organization like that? That actually puts limits on your interneting? Don't want to force get you in trouble, but and sometimes individuals doing it. I have a second cousin who at 15 is being more sexually active than we would like her to be, and her father has put keystroke logging and video capture equipment secretly on her computer just to make sure she's not going to run off with an interesting young man who says he's 16 and is really 40. Okay, point 3 is social networks are getting bigger. I'd say the data isn't great on this, but certainly I'd put the weak form, they're not getting smaller. They're more specialized, that the people you do socializing with turn out to be not the people you get money from. The people you get money from have a very unique name. They're called parents. Although when the parents get to 90s, it gets reversed and then the kids start giving money. But people are moving among many different groups. It's a differentiated set of networks. So a lot more uncertainty is involved and some maneuvering. And they're larger. As I'll show you in a second, if we use the World Internet Project's data from the US, there's been about a 30% increase in the number of people that are called friends. And the media has become the new neighborhood. I spend a lot more time on Twitter talking to friends of mine who are scattered around North America, and 1 or 2 in Europe and Israel, than I do on the street corner talking to my friends. But it turns out that in the old days, people didn't spend much time finding community, at least in Toronto. They stayed home and watched television. So if you think of the internet as displacing television, then you're actually getting more interactions now than before. This, yeah, it's pretty readable. This slide, these are non-internet users, moderate users, I forget what our criteria was, and heavy internet users. And you can see actually the non-users' friendships are the lowest of them all, and that even though the questions were asked the same, there's been a sizable increase in the number of people called friends who are seen in person at least once a week in the US. I'm not sure why it's going on. The way that study was asked doesn't have detailed reasoning, but we think the internet is helping people remain in contact, even for non-internet users. Non-internet users are only 20% of the American population, adult population now, and many of the non-users are dying off. They're old like me and they never got on. And what they're doing is cycling among many partial groups. When you inventory the number of groups that they're with, they seem to be a greater number than before. And that's a big problem with Facebook or MySpace. Anybody on MySpace here? A couple of people. Your social class inappropriate. The study's done that shows that middle class folks are almost always on Facebook, by the way. Enjoy. I mean, maybe you like bad rock bands and stuff like that. But they all assume everybody's part of one happy network. Well, if I want to crack a dirty joke, I don't think I want my mother-in-law at 96 to be reading that joke. And I would like to be able to titrate, to differentiate among the different networks that I'm putting that stuff into. Twitter does a little bit better. It's asymmetric. So I can have people following me who I'm not following, and I can block anybody when I want to. So people are having spent a lot of time calculating where they get help. And Rochelle Cote, Gabrielle Plickert, and I just did a study and found out that the most important criteria for getting help is helping somebody else. The golden rule is a very instrumental rule. If you want to predict to getting help in the future, do it now. Pay it forward. We have hard data on that. And so there's a lot of interest-based communities going on as a result of, compared to the original Oregon communities where people were just basically focusing on kin and locality. By the way, I'm caricaturing. Everything I say is predominantly true, I believe, but it's also untrue. I mean, you can find a lot of long-distance communities going back certainly to the Middle Ages. It's well documented. For example, the Royal Society people, shepherds, travelers, and certainly when my grandparents came over in 1905 from Russia and Moldova, you know, they were certainly carrying their community with them, but the difference is now almost every immigrant we talk to goes back almost every day to read the newspaper or listen to a radio station, whatever their country of origin was, or whereas my grandparents came, they basically burned their communication bridges and never looked back at Russia and never had communication. This guy's an exception. Actually, he barely exists anymore. This is from an old documentary. He's living on a former oil rig platform in the North Sea, and it's being run as a secure data center, mostly for gambling. And he sees nobody except once a month the helicopter gives him food. He hasn't quite figured out how to download food from the internet. And we call this globalization, the fact that you're globally connected, but at the same time you're locally involved, that people really care about their local ties, they neighbor a lot, and their neighboring online helps their neighboring going offline. I don't know how this slide got there, but and very few friends of any sort. This isn't just once a week. We know the average North American has about 250, 300 people who they feel somewhat close to. But you can see that of that number, only 6 now, or depending which bar you look at, but 4 or 5 or 6 are online-only kind of people. And many of the online people migrate to offline relationships. You get together, just like Dr. Fitzpatrick and I have been emailing back and forth. And you know, yesterday I had the pleasure of meeting him for the first time, and now we're friends for life. Jane Jacobs, who many of you may have heard about when she was stopping expressways in New York City, and then many of you may not have heard, moved to Toronto for the last 30+ years of her life, said we need a lot of eyes on the street. That's the way to keep neighborhoods safe. And actually, with people using the internet a lot, they're actually often sitting by a window, and they're getting a lot of eyes on the street going on. And I've done distance modeling papers that show this very, very strongly. Here's a picture of suburban Toronto in the summertime. You can see good way to know is there are no polar bears out. Anybody believe that? Anyway, we did a study here, and it was the first wired suburb in 1996 when, if any of you were online, then you almost always had dial-up access. And the telephone company, which is screwed up as other telephone companies are elsewhere, but Bell Canada, said we're going to wire the whole neighborhood as an experiment for high-speed internet. This is before broadband took hold and before you couldn't do it over normal phone and cable lines. And but they only got around to doing about 60%. So we had a nice comparative experiment between those who randomly got wired up and those who weren't. Couldn't do that now with 80% American population wired. And you can see, these are just the ratios right here, that those who are online knew more people, knew them by name, visited with them. Any possible criteria is the internet was bolstering neighboring. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but people often work in networked way, especially folks like us who push symbols around rather than things. Eleanor Wynn did a study at Intel, and she found out that the average person was in 5 separate teams during the week, meeting with different peoples. Certainly those of us who are academics know that to be very, very strongly too, that we're totally reconfiguring relationships going on. We've done one study of a high-tech organization where they used face-to-face contact, email contact, and IM very, very extensively, but they had a couple of rules. They only IM'd each other and never upstairs to their supervisors or their boss. They emailed those people sometimes, and face-to-face even more rarely. So there was some stratification rules built into there. We did a big study in Northern Ontario, and one of the things we found in an area that can only be compared to, we'll say, Northern Alaska, well away from Sarah Palin, kind of really Northern Alaska. Sarah is in Shopping Mall, Alaska. And we found it wonderful in this area for medical help. You know, like all civilized countries, we have free health care for everybody, and that means the Canadian, Ontario government is trying to save money and save lives because it's cheaper for them. So what they did do is they put in high-resolution cameras so that when you pull out and you show your incision, a nurse practitioner in this very isolated town will take the picture and it'll go down to the surgeon to see if it's healing well. If you do telemetry on your blood pressure, on blood tests or urine analysis, those too go by telemetry. And that's saving lives. Not only are you getting very quick feedback, but in much of Canada, driving, especially up north, driving 5 hours each way is a very devastating trip. Not only is there ice and snow, and usually the roads aren't very well plowed up there, but secondly, and I'm not making this one up, there are moose along the road. They especially like to graze and lick salt right at the road edge, and people die that way. So it's really, really an interesting way of building in these kinds of things. On the other hand, when I asked my students recently about how technology is used at their work, almost without exception, and University of Toronto students almost always have part-time jobs, said that they're being surveilled by cameras. I don't mean overt ones like the one behind me here, but the hidden ones that are up there and there. And it's just not in Las Vegas nightclubs now. They're everywhere. And they're certainly aware of that. And they know how to circumvent them if they need to also. Oh, I'm going to skip these. We're running out of time. Okay. This one's sort of obvious, but worth talking about. You're getting more information from more sources. In the old days, up until about 7 years ago, there used to be the two-step flow of communication was our assumption. You heard about things in the mass media, and then you checked it out interpersonally with your friends and neighbors. But now you may be hearing it in mass media, or you may be hearing it from a friend who heard it on a blog or on a specialized news site or had it Twittered. I never thought of using Twitter, Sarah, for news service, but it makes some sense. And then you go back and you check it online, and then you talk to your friends, and you're doing almost an infinite back and forth checking about what's going on. So the good and the bad news is you don't have to rely on the experts. I don't know about you, but every time I get a medical prescription, I ask my doctor about side effects, but then I go home and I ask Google about side effects, and usually you look it up in Wikipedia, which happens to be pretty good on medical stuff. The bad news is everybody becomes a relatively equal network. I have been talking, this is a unique version of this talk, but I've been talking about this stuff for about 10 years, and I'm always asked, isn't the internet killing community? It is as if someone who's never done the research is equally as important as someone who's done a great deal of research going on. And it's, in healthcare, that can be a particularly dangerous stuff. So people are building online communities. They're defining their brand or their presence online. Men and women, the gender gap is over in North America. The age gap is shrinking as non-users basically die off. Or I haven't heard about any old age homes that are filled with computer terminals. That would be kind of an interesting thing to happen. We know television is used as pacifiers there. I wonder about computer terminals. And people are doing a very common lifestyle kind of switch. This is a slide about 5 years ago. It's interesting, this is, as I said, not a youngish audience. When I showed this slide to computer scientists, their reaction was, oh my God, she's still using an old CRT. And we're getting a lot of interest groups. They're being growing up. And this is, as I said at the beginning of the talk, where I think Dr. Putnam had it wrong, although we don't have it tremendously well documented yet. Although, Shauna, I hope you can do the documentation for youth kids going on. So, what's going on? Well, sort of heading to the roundup. You take ICTs, information communication technologies, such as the internet and mobile phones, plus social networks, you have people being creators, not just consumers of media. I mean, many people in this room have kept diaries, but now people are putting them online, and they're calling them blogs. And sometimes they'll blog around their course, and they'll blog about me, and I have a blog checker, which tells me within 24 hours if anybody's mentioned my name. And then I'll write them a note saying, you know, you really misunderstood my fallacy yesterday. That's a line that Marshall McLuhan used in Annie Hall, if those of you go way back. And they're shocked. How are you reading this stuff? How dare you read this stuff? Well, I read it because Google searched for your name and found it. And so we're having a redefinition of public and private. A guy was twittering about me in the lecture yesterday. I didn't like what he wrote, so I wrote him a response. And I think he's upset, but I haven't really checked back. And, you know, if you call publication putting pictures up on Flickr, probably well over half this room has done stuff like that. You can password protect it, but most people don't. And then people start commenting on it, and the comments may lead you to a new form of friendship and a new form of what's going on. And people are spending a lot of time on this. What's giving? TV's giving, and sleep is giving. So, the last of the 12 points is the interpenetration of private and public. People, as I said, were revealing their inner thoughts to a wide audience. You know, one of my collaborators yesterday, Benzine Gal, to be, as her nickname on Twitter, wrote, I wonder if little Larry is okay. He's off with his father today. It's a bad divorce situation. And I wrote to her, I said, Helen, what the heck are you doing? This shouldn't be out on Twitter. The world can see this kind of thing. She said, well, I never thought of it that way. But yet anybody can be searching those kind of tweets. Social availability, where you are at any moment, as we pointed out earlier, can be kind of frightening. But it could be kind of nice. You know, if I had a way to find out that I had people I knew in Little Rock, I might have gotten in contact with them before, and now I just get to see them in the audience and maybe talk a little bit afterwards. So there's a lot of surveillance going on. You probably know, if not, you should know, that the great majority of American email messages, and certainly until recently, were flowing through a locked office at the AT&T headquarters in San Francisco. They're read by officials of a U.S. government body, which I don't know for sure, but is probably the NSA, National Security Agency. Yeah, depends on how you feel about that. When you go into any shopping mall, your picture's on video. And my friend Steve Mann likes, as a guerrilla theater thing, to walk in with a big video camera and start shooting Walmart. I'm sorry, this is U.S. Shooting by video. Walmart and other things like that, which invariably brings the security guards down on him. Steve's written a book about this, and he and I have written an article called Surveillance. And brings the security guards down, and Steve says, well, your video surveilling me, why can't I surveil you? And they say the regulations prevent it. And then Steve will ask for those regulations, and they don't exist, by the way, and every time he's asked. But he also has credentials from a fictitious corporation in China that it's a real corporation, but he invented it for this purpose, on beautiful letterhead. And it says you are required to video wherever you go to document your existence and tell us that you are safe. And so we have this kind of clash of the two. It still doesn't work. And he deliberately picked China because you can't call up, it's 12 noon there, it's midnight there, so you can't quite do those kinds of things. A lot of upset. I don't know if Google Street View has gotten to Little Rock or Fayetteville yet. And, hope you're out with your above board partner rather than somebody else at that moment. But it turns out my students don't care. Yeah, so we're blogging, so we're talking. We got nothing to hide, even when they do have stuff to hide. I Facebook friended my niece. I don't have any kids, but I have a niece who's 20. She's down on Tulane. And in her freshman year, I was on for one day with her because I looked at the thing. She's standing there with her arms around another woman, but holding a 40-ouncer in her hand. I decided I didn't need to know that. Although she didn't care, it turned out. She said, yeah. But I know IBM up in Toronto, Center for Advanced Study, every time they take in summer interns, they say, look, we don't care if you're on Facebook or not, but we're going to check your page in 48 hours. Every one of those pages gets sanitized immediately. It's the sort of the moment of adulthood that takes place then. As I said earlier, people are talking about their love lives loudly on the streetcars and buses. And so we had what I think is a major change in organizing society in terms of networks that are augmented by personal communication that is more than just the gee whizness of any medium. People ask me, they say, well, aren't you upset that when your book comes out, everything's going to change? By the way, my standard answer is what's going to happen next is how do I know? If I did, I would have bought Google stock instead of saying, how are they going to make any money on this? And it's really a new network society paradigm in which the individual is operating, but it's not individualism in the Cheney tradition. It's individualism as constrained and also acted upon by networks in which people are achieving their goals very much through personal agency, but acting with others. And I'm going to argue, as the very last slide today, that it's part of a major change in how we're organizing our society, way down to the ending of the Cold War blocks. Remember Dean Rusk and Sino-Soviet Empire talking about, to a much more fluid operation with conglomerates being replaced by organizations, shared organizations such as Star Alliance or One World and away from autarky, in which every corporation did everything, to outsourcing, in which medical transcriptions are done a lot in the Philippines and India every night. And my cousin lost her job that way. So it's really, really a big change. And I think it has some profound consequences for how we live your life. And I'd love to discuss it with you further as we get beyond thinking about the media as such to basically the structural changes happening. Thank you very much.
We do have time for some questions, so if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Right here.
Who's calling? Your call.
Hi, my name is Todd Moore. I'm a student here. Thank you for coming and joining us today. Very inspiring, and we're all connected in a lot of different networks here. My question is more about the backside of social networking. For example, the number of different newspapers that are going out of business due to Craigslist, and the different types of blogs that are popping up. that are really, some say, watering down traditional news institutions. Will you talk a little bit about that and what you think the impact is on social networks and established institutions like news media and whatnot?
Yeah, I don't think blogs are doing it. I mean, most blogs aren't worth a damn, and I think they're more for the individual's masturbatory gratification than as a mode of communication. But Craigslist is real. My wife is now selling. Anybody want a 650cc Yamaha Cruiser? My wife is selling her motorcycle. You got to come to Toronto. And we put it on Craigslist. We didn't put it on a newspaper. And newspapers made a lot of money out of that form of advertising, and it's basically died up very, very badly. Retail is drying up too, and that's a result of the lack of regulation of U.S. financial agencies, and you know the story here too, but it's not an accident that we're in a depression now. And you know, I'm not very happy that you're dragging the rest of the world in it, actually, except for Canada. Our banks actually were tightly regulated and never went nuts. But being we're so dependent on U.S. economy, we're the second biggest auto industry in the world. In North America, we're concerned about that. Yeah, I'm going to miss newspapers. I don't think the personalized reading of things is the same as serendipitously finding lots and lots of stuff going on. And I've never sent a news feed with more than about 50 articles. I would miss the New York Times more than the Rocky Mountain Post, which just folded in Denver, because the Times and the Washington Post are doing really fine jobs on a breadth of stories, even when they get things wrong like Iraq. But stuff happens, you know. The horse manure industry died, and the pollution industry grew in the U.S., and so farmers had to turn elsewhere for fertilizer. So, I mean, change is. It's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's a thing. Thanks.
Right here.
Thanks. Barry, it's good to see you again. I just have a question of whether you've ever studied individual variability on the private-public spectrum about people. For example, when I realized that posts I made to internet use groups in 1991 are still instantly accessible by Google, I get very skittish what I put on posts. And I wonder whether there isn't a continuum of private versus public in the way people think about themselves.
No, unfortunately. I mean, you're a dean, or were, and other people are, and they watch what they say as much as deans do. But most people forget, accept that their buddies who they flesh meet with really exist, and they get into shock when as the people Google about me do, when I actually call them on it. Maybe we should have what we call civil inattention. An old word comes out of Irving Goffman in sociology, and make believe we're not seeing that stuff. But it's kind of hard. Everybody for the first 2 days Twitters very carefully, and then they start twittering dirty jokes and stuff like that, or whatever they're doing, and that stuff is searchable, and you're right. And you know, I try to live by President Obama's rule, which he said I would never send an email that I didn't want broadcast on CNN the next day. But without having hard evidence, I'm very skeptical that that's true for the overwhelming majority of people. And it's not true for me, too. I mean, I make mistakes. I talk dirty about my chairman sometimes. Praise be his name. But, you know, life goes on.
In the front, right here.
Thank you. Rolf Wiggin, ULR. I'm puzzled about the following thing. How does one explain that obviously younger people have friendsters on MySpace, Facebook, to the tune of 3,000, 3,600 and so on, and that is a prestigious thing? What is happening there? Is it collecting friendsters?
Mm-hmm.
And with that comes prestige?
Yeah, it's penis envy, pure and simple. Mine is bigger than yours. Same thing's happening on Twitter. I check out, everybody wants to follow me on Twitter, and when it goes over 500 or so, I wondered, they're not going to be reading my stuff, so why do they want to do it? They're collecting. But it's a media myth that most people have that many friends. I spoke to Cameron Marlowe, who is the student of my student, so he's my kind of intellectual grandchild. and he's head of research at Facebook. He says the mean number is somewhere about 150. And that's the more prevalent kind of thing. I didn't get the standard deviations, but if we sort of think of a spread between 50 and 300, I think that might be accurate. But I think there's also, and as Russ Bernard showed at the University of Florida with a variety of studies, the average North American carries around 300 ties even before the internet, so that's not too strange a number. Excuse me. One thing I think that will happen is that people are going to start cutting back on their Facebooks. They realize it's a time sink. I did want to know that my cousin died yesterday. I didn't want to know, Rolf, that you had a bad movement last night or something like that. And people do put that stuff on Twitter. So we're having a lot of information overload. And there's a movement that is only anecdotal. I haven't seen any survey data to it, that people are defriending others. Trouble is when you defriend somebody on Facebook, they get to know about it, if I remember. And that could cause a rupture. On Twitter, I'm just blocking a number of people because I can't see why on earth they've listed me. And one guy was really, I knew why he listed me. He wanted to get me when I said an uncautious thing. So I put a block on him getting any Twitter messages from me. But a lot of these aren't true friends. Yeah, Rolf used the term Friendster. Friendster is still in existence, but nobody uses it in North America anymore, or hardly anybody. But it's really, as Dana Boyne pointed out, what the latent weaker ties. But latent ties are fine. I can get to see you a little bit when I'm here in Little Rock and Steve, and we can kind of pick up with each other, and that's wonderful. So they're not all our bosom friends who we spend a lot of time with in Toronto, and I think Toronto is probably pretty representative in most American cities. The average number of people you really care about is about 5 or 6, and that's been true since 1968. We've studied that 3 times. It's gone up a little bit. And I think it's gone up with the internet because you're carrying memories of people who may live 1,000 miles from you, but because you're on email with them a lot, they're more salient in your lives now.
We have time for one more question right there.
Really, 2 things I'd like to hear your thoughts on. The first is the large amount of money that's going in and it's backing these social networking sites. And then kind of right along with that, could you talk about what happened to MySpace? It was growing, and then it kind of plateaued, and then now Facebook seems to have taken over, and where does that leave MySpace?
Well, it left the owners $800 million richer when they sold out to Murdoch, News Corporation. What was your first part of your question? I'm sorry, I missed that. Yeah, the money is people want to make money, but none of these sites are making money. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, the guy who invented Facebook, is often talked about as a billionaire, but I was just meditating on it. He's a billionaire when he sells the company, but until he sells it, he's not getting a cash income stream from that company. He may be getting some salary stuff kind of going. He's still walking around in a ratty T-shirt. I saw him about a year ago. You know, he looked like any other undergraduate in my campus kind of thing. So they're all desperately trying to figure out how to monetize it. One of the things they're doing is collecting a lot of information about you. So they know your demographics, and they want to know about your friends, and then if they can get a Google interface, I mean, the scary part is if, say, Google and Facebook or any search engine and Facebook merge, then they'll know where you're going to search, and they'll know your demographics at the same time. That's sellable information to corporations for marketing purposes, as well as for surveillance purposes. Why Facebook over MySpace? I've heard, I don't have any hard evidence. Read Dana Boyd's dissertation on it, just came out, University of California, Berkeley, School of Information. She thinks that Facebook has a stronger cachet as a more sophisticated, modern kind of thing, and that therefore the word of mouth has been better on it than MySpace. And probably it's seen as more user-friendly, although some of the things they're doing make me wonder about it, than MySpace, which is owned by a big, rather unpleasant corporation, the News Corp, Rudolph Murdoch's organization. A lot of my students say Facebook's prettier to look at, MySpace is too ugly, too cluttered. So there may be other things going on there. I'm not really sure.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dan, for bringing him down. Thank all y'all.
Thank you.